I request Mr. Brian Phelps, Professional Services Director, Thales eSecurity, to come on stage and share his vision. A big round of applause for Mr. Brian Phelps.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks everyone. I'm Brian Phelps, the Director of Professional Services for Thales eSecurity in EMEA. Thales is one of the sponsors of the event, but honestly, this slide will be about the last time I talk directly about my organization. I'm here today to present the results of a report. It's the 2017 Data Threat Report. This report is actually authored by a research organization out of Boston, Massachusetts called 451 Research. It is a survey of 1,100 CIOs. These are the chief information officers from Global 2000 organizations, from governmental departments, from some nonprofits, from some banks. This represents the thinking of some of the largest CIOs in the world. We ask 140 total questions around budget, around historical concerns, around their fears looking forward, and the report is about 20 pages of pretty concise data. And so if you're looking for a source of what your industry peers are thinking about and where they're spending their money, it's a really valuable document. I'd encourage you to, it's available online, I would encourage you to download it today. Unfortunately, however, I'm going to be repeating some of the comments and threads of the previous speakers. Part of the report deals with the regulation landscape and the state of affairs in terms of the number of breaches and other trends in the industry. The very first large trend is sadly this disconnect. The good news is that budget is up. Security spending last year by these 1,100 CIOs was reported to be up by 73%. The bad news is that 86% of those 1,100 CIOs still feel their networks are very vulnerable to attack. And most depressingly of all, 68% of the CIOs interviewed, 68% admit to being breached in previous years. Now the truth is, if 68% of them are on the record admitting it, probably that number is actually much higher. So let me dig into some of the individual statistics out of the report. Again, this looks at the trend over the past couple of years. The right-hand graph is showing the budgetary increase. So again, healthy increases in security spending. And yet, the number of breaches that is, as self-reported, is up 5% on last year, and over 8% from years before that. So spending up, but the number of breaches up. So this question was about CIO's own interpretation of the threats against their network. And what you see here is across the world, broken out by regions, you see a fear of, this is self-reported fear of being vulnerable. And in the United States, you've got 90% of CIOs admit that their networks are vulnerable, and almost 30%, 29% admit they are very vulnerable to attack. And those ratios vary depending on where you are in the world, but the theme here is that virtually every CIO is very concerned. I mean, the buildings at the top of the graph show the worldwide numbers. 88% of CIOs across the world admit they're vulnerable, and 30% admit they are very vulnerable to breach. These numbers should depress all of us. So, a previous speaker touched on compliance, and compliance therefore implies regulatory control, regulatory requirements. I guess this is good news that 59% of CIOs acknowledge that it's compliance that's the largest driver of security controls within their organization. I think this is one area, again, agreeing with the previous speaker, I think this is one area where India is slightly behind other parts of the world. I'm based in the UK, and next year in March, the the EU implements GDPR, which is the EU standard for the protection of data. For the first time, there will be some very substantial possible penalties for organizations that incur data breaches. We are already seeing in the market in Europe that bringing in GDPR regulation is forcing change into organizations to tighten up their security even further. In the worst cases, in egregious examples, especially in examples dealing with data of children, actually a data breach could result in a jail term for certain officers in organizations. So we are seeing that regulatory issues is driving, one of the major drivers from CIOs is the compliance landscape. So where are CIOs spending their budget? So 88% of them are spending it in network defenses. 69%, and that's up 4.5% from the prior year. Almost 70% are spending it on endpoint protection, again, up from a prior year, and you can see in ranked order. The problem with this graph is, although these numbers are increasing, it's almost like they're fighting, there's an old expression about an army is always training to fight the previous war. And the spending pattern is again representing the previous problems. It's focusing on endpoints. It's focusing on perimeter edge defenses. We've just seen that, and the prior speaker from FireEye admits that no matter every network, you have to plan every network as if it will be breached. And so this spending pattern actually, perhaps part of the problem that we're seeing in this report with both spending and data breaches going up is the money is being spent, the budget is being allocated to fight last year's battles. Another issue raised by the CIO, and again, I think the previous speaker talked about the talent pool or the talent shortage, and lack of shortage of technical talent was cited as one of the top problems of why CIOs are still seeing the number of data breaches. It is the number of true data security experts available on the market is a fairly small number, and the entire world has a demand, an incredible and increasing demand for data security experts. I mean, frankly, if any of you are parents of 11, 12, 13-year-olds, this is a fantastic business to go into if you want your children to have future employment. Okay, so a large section of the report deals with sources of attacks. Where are these attacks coming from? And the report breaks them into inside and outside threat actors. The single largest reported inside threat actor is the privileged user. I mean, painfully, the network administrator. It's very difficult. You must have people in your organizations that have privileged access. They have to administer the networks themselves. They cannot do their job without privileged access. And yet, that same level of privilege gives them the technical ability to, in some cases, to breach the network. Interestingly, and I think kind of amusingly, the second most popular report of breach is executive management. And that's probably a combination of, I suspect some of that is not as intentional as the privileged user attack. That's probably just an education issue as opposed to an intent issue. But again, these are the areas, ordinary employee third and contractor fourth. These are the insider attack concerns as reported by those 1,100 CIOs. So, scary. The headline makes clear, you know, if you read the technical press these days, what gets all the press is the threat of nation-state actors. You can't pick up a major international newspaper right now without reading about the threat of alleged Russian hackers in various election schemes and other malfeasance. But again, interviewing those 1,100 CIOs, their concern is not so much the nation-state attackers, but common cyber criminals. You know, people who are in it for the money is basically how you can describe those guys. To a smaller extent, hacktivists. Again, previous speaker was talking about the threat of terrorism. I think in this context, we would put the cyber terrorists and hacktivists together in one bucket and refer to that group as such. Interestingly, cloud. Again, hard to pick up a IT article these days and not have cloud somewhere in the print. And what you see in just 1 year is a jump of, you know, in 2016, only one of the data security controls that CIOs reported as important dealt with clouds. This year, 4 of 5 are cloud-based controls. So just in 1 year, you can see the change in thinking of CIOs. This went from security in the cloud in 2016 was yeah, I got to do something there. In 2017, it literally dominates 4 out of the 5 categories for security spending. And again, back to the regulations. An interesting point here, and again, if you read the report, there are several examples of this. The rather large variance we see between countries where the CIOs are reporting that regulation is driving their thinking when it comes to network security. In Germany, it's the highest rate reported at 81%. Where 81% of the spending on security in organizations is being driven by regulatory issues, and that's down to 56% in Japan. So again, if you're looking to clarify some thinking around what your peers are doing internationally, there's some good data in the report. So what is the solution? And I think that's something the report doesn't answer, but I've got 2 slides that touch on the solution to this issue. And give credit where credit's due. This is not my quote. This is Edward Snowden. Encryption works. Properly implemented strong crypto systems are one of the few things that you can rely on. You know, this is his view of what one technology. If you have to assume networks are going to be penetrated, and you basically have to make that assumption now. If you have to assume, to use again the term from the prior speaker, dwell time of an attacker, he's going to get in your network. Again, the report from the prior speaker showed an average of 500 days inside of your network. If you are going to assume all of that is true, then the last thing, the last line of defense is actually the data itself. So our recommendation, encrypt everything. Assume that your systems are going to be breached, assume attackers will be inside your firewalls, assume they will be on your systems. The last line of defense is actually the data itself. There's a fantastic YouTube video out there from a company called Square. They're a payments processor in California. They make a little square dongle that plugs on top of an iPhone. And if you look for it, they have their dev team and their CIO standing talking about the system that they have built. And what they have built is a way to implement encryption across all their data in their network so that if they're attacked, and they too assume they will be attacked, but if they're attacked, it forces the attacker to only work with the data on their network. What they want to prevent is an attacker getting into their network and copying terabytes of data or megabytes of data out of their network, taking it home, taking it offline, and doing something else with it. By encrypting it and forcing the attacker to stay on their network, it dramatically increases the likelihood that they will be identified and stopped. So it's the data itself, encrypting that data itself is the last line of defense against attackers. So that's my 15 minutes, and I've been told that we will be taking questions outside after the event. Again, I'm with Thales, and like the previous speaker, we've got a booth outside. Feel free to stop by and ask any questions. Thank you.
Thanks to Mr. Brian Phelps from Thales Security. Yes, indeed, data is important and securing that data. And according to him, encryption is the way. Let's hope for the best. I'll request Mr. Golok Kumar Simli, Head Technology, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, to come on stage and give the memento to Mr. Brian Phelps. A big round of applause for Mr. Brian Phelps from Thales eSecurity.